I believe there's a time for defending and fighting and a time for talking. And it's undoubtedly extremely hard to talk and fight at the same time. So in this way, I think the PKK's decision that it's time to pursue their goals through peaceful and democratic means was a really bold one. And it is bold, I think, tactically, strategically, and in its own way, kind of ethically. You know, the call, which I was one of the many people in the world who listened to it, or read his statement in translation and his call, and it's quite powerful, isn't it? And I think that I know this is not quite his words, but that notion that there's no path outside of democracy and democratic consensus is the path. And I think I found that it's such an important and courageous perspective, and must be very demanding for everyone in a way, because that's all to be realized into the future. One of the challenges, yes, is that he was already, as I understand the history, he was already an advocate of choosing a peaceful path or exploring a democratic option, even from the time when he was a victim of extraordinary rendition and ended up in prison all those years ago. And this is a real challenge, obviously, for the movement. That's the fact that he remains on Imrani Island, and it remains doesn't have the freedom and the access to play this role. But also it's a challenge, I think, for the future of the process, and not just for him, but for anybody who plays a role of taking these chances of negotiating for peace. And how do you always face the risks of, well, the historic risks that are a result of prescription of the PKK, but also the risk of being arrested or detained, as even though you are acting as an advocate for peace. So it's both a really profound and important call, but it's also obviously a real challenge. And I think I can imagine, and I know that in order for processes like this to move forward, one of the prerequisites is you need your political leadership to be able to fully participate. I very recently have had the opportunities to act as an advisor with for not an armed conflict, but still a conflict over sovereignty, and that was a conflict between the government of and the people of Catalonia and Spain. And one of the things that they first had to do was in order to engage on this process was to try and secure the release of their leadership who were in prison. And they were successful in that process. And I think there's relevant lessons even for this Kurdish context from how they did that. How did they move from? Well, they made a number of successes, but it started with getting their leadership released, and then they had to create a kind of a safer legal environment for addressing the conflict, which involved negotiations on changing the Spanish criminal code, the penal code. That one of the useful tools for those interested in peace and conflict resolution processes is to study relevant comparative examples, and while many insights can be gained in Turkey from studying many processes, I thought that perhaps one of the most resonant processes has been the conflict between the Basque nationalist movement and the Spanish state. And I don't know how much you know about it, but there was following something called the Ayete Peace Conference in Donostia and San Sebastian back in September 2011, and then which I'll tell you a little bit about. And then this was followed by a month later by ETA's announcement for what they called a definitive end to its armed activities, which then was followed. It took 6 years, but 6 years after that, in April 2017, by its disbandment. And then in 2018, after almost 60 years of violent confrontation, they gave up arms. And this has been followed by, since then, 7 more years of quiet negotiations with the Spanish government, which have led to real significant change. And I think these are there are many of these worth study for people who stand between the parties, that groups in conflict, even prescribed organizations and armed groups, they need help in finding ways to embrace peaceful politics with confidence. And very few international organizations have the political courage to provide this kind of support. And if a movement can retain its unity and its commitment to its long-term goals, uh, uh, that it has not been defeated. And I think the Basque nationalist movement began an internal process of reflection and change, just as the PKK has done, with a commitment that wherever that led, whatever they decided, they would stay together. And I think that they seem to have been so far very successful on this. And though no doubt there was a number of people who didn't agree with the decision for the dissolution and disarmament, they've not formed a splinter movement. And as a result, I think the legal Basque nationalist parties have now been able to make real political gains democratically. That I was involved with back then at the AETA conference, they had international figures, former heads of state at the AETA conference, including Kofi Annan, messages from President Jimmy Carter, Tony Blair, and other former heads of state from Ireland and Norway. And this was really important in emphasizing the benefits of peace and the costs of violence. What's happening in the Kurdish movement is unique, is specific, but there are lessons to be learned from other contexts where others have found ways of even taking the initiative, not waiting for the initiative from the state, but taking the initiative. And the Basque region was one of them. There's a whole community of capability, both around the world, but also in Europe, people who know how to support learning about negotiations, making strategy, But the directive has to come from within. The initiative has to come from within. And some organizations are willing to also take whatever chances are required to help promote peaceful change. I think that what again we saw in the Basque context was it was the Basque movements who took the initiative. The internationals responded, but it wasn't an internationally led in any way. I would love to be able to play supportive roles, So always that's what I've dedicated myself to do.